So let's do a little meditation motivation, in lieu of doing some verbal prayers. So if you're like me, you need to calm as much as possible. So begin with something very easy, the breathing. In fact, I'm going to set my legs in a stable position. As you're watching the breathing, let go of other thoughts, even if you can let go of the sense of an observer, just as though being the breath. Follow one respiration down to your heart area. Just abide there with your mental consciousness observing previous moments of consciousness. Learning to extricate yourself, not getting stuck into any of the thought patterns that arise, not getting involved in them, just letting them go. Remind yourself it's not the eye consciousness you're watching, nor the ear, the nose, the tongue, the tactile. First, just the events of the mental consciousness, what's arising within it. And then as you let go of those, you're perpetuating the appearance of those thoughts and sounds, appearances to the mind, just perceiving the ambient nature, like a clear sky. Let go of the body, let go of the sense of I. Try to recognize something more fundamental about ourself. It's not our soul, but the nature of our mind, which is clear, unblemished by any of the activities we've done. All the mental states being just transitory events within it, like clouds in the sky. Some white, some black. No abiding, lasting ego identity. Self just labeled to the body and mind, or the subtle body and mind. All the appearances that occur arising because of karma, recognizing all living beings exactly equal with ourself, having the same plight, circling without control in cyclic existence, sometimes experiencing some pleasure, some respite, some relaxation, but quickly dissipated, quickly gone. Most of the time experiencing very unsatisfactory, very fearful, suffering states of hell, and as ghosts, as animals, even some states as humans. Obviously suffering. Even if we can't keep that in mind all the time in our own being, recognizing that the truth of that, the suffering nature of cyclic existence, not only wishing for ourselves to be free of that, to find everlasting happiness, but thinking how wonderful it would be if all living beings who've been my mother, my brother, my sister, intimate friends numberless times, who've helped me in the past, and who are benefiting me even now, even when they appear as enemy, wishing that they could be free of this cyclic existence, that they could find everlasting, blissful happiness of enlightenment. Knowing the path to that has its stages, and in order to understand the subtle intention, the profound intention of the Buddha, I'm going to listen, study again tonight, think about, contemplate, even meditate during the class on the various philosophical systems that Buddha presented to lead people to the subtlest, most profound view of emptiness, so that I can achieve the two goals, the goal of others, the goal of myself. The goal of others, from my perspective, is to achieve the two form bodies that can benefit others, the Nirmanakaya and the Sambhogakaya, the emanation body and the enjoyment body. And the welfare of myself, the aim of myself, is to achieve the wisdom Dharmakaya and the nature Dharmakaya, the Svabhavikakaya. So for that purpose, I'm going to participate in the class tonight and in the discourse of study to quickly achieve the state that brings about those two aims, the state of enlightenment. Relax. Bring your attention back. Oh, so some intrepid, a couple more intrepid warriors here tonight. What did someone said last time? This is the tougher class or something? Did someone say that? Of the two classes that are going on now. Not sure. This is certainly the other one's harder to apply, or this is harder to apply? Mind and mental factors is harder to. I don't know. This is one of the first classes that they study in the monasteries. Usually, mind and mental factors is studied later, but so. Some of you may have read ahead or reviewed what we said before or have questions about what we talked about. So let me first check if anyone has questions. Thea, you have some question? No? Karen? Frank must have a question. Oh, he's going. This is your last day, right? Oh. Mm-hmm. Really? Okay. Who said that? Patton? Arnold. MacArthur? Oh, I thought Patton said that. Oh, General MacArthur. Okay.
No, that was MacArthur.
It was MacArthur? Okay, good. I think we got that straight. So, but do you have any questions?
No, okay. This is my first.
Oh, this is your first class, okay. Uma?
I don't know enough to ask.
Okay, good. That's good, honest answer. Okay, so I won't try to extract questions from you if you don't have any to be extracted. So we were talking about the Vaibhashika system last time, and just to kind of to give a little review, the text that we're studying is the monastic textbook of Sarah J. Monastery. Sarah has two colleges, you know, Sarah J. and Sarah May. As Rinpoche had mentioned, in the past there was at least one other college. You know what that was? Sarah Nakpa. So there was a tantric college at Sarah in the old days. I think there's some of the meditators in Dharamsala, Venerable may know, she's just leaving, are some of the old monks were members of Sarah Nakpa. I don't know when it was disbanded, maybe after 1959. It was very small. But Sarah J., Sarah May had different monastic textbooks. So this is not the general textbook of Sarah. This is the monastic textbook of Sarah J. in general, by Jason Trukhi Gelsen, who was considered to be an emanation of Manjushri and wrote most of the texts that Sarah J. monks studied. And it's talking about the four Buddhist philosophical schools. It doesn't go into any detail about the non-Buddhist schools as some of the other texts that you have as supplementary reading go into. So we jumped in last time, and let me just see. Carrie, do you know the name of the four main schools?
Vaibhashaka, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka.
Did you hear that? The Vaibhashika. Tibetans say Chedamawa. That's the one we're studying first. And the Sautrantika, like sutra, Sautran. The R is after the T, Sautrantika. The Chittamatra, the people who practice that are Chittamatrins, and the Madhyamaka. Okay, and so we mentioned how many different kinds of Vaibhashikas? 18 schools of Vaibhashika. Here in this text, what did it say? Divided into how many sections? Mark, do you remember? Three, okay. I wasn't sure. That was two. There's three. And what were they?
Magadha, Kashmiri, and the one she just mentioned.
The hot
The Aparantikas. So I guess that's a way of dividing all 18 schools into this. It's not like those are separate. It's just another way of dividing them up. And the school that we know today, most famous of the Hinayana that's prevalent in the world, in fact, we think of as the only school, the Theravada, is actually one of those 18 schools. In Sanskrit, it's called the Staiviravada, the school of the elders. If you're a monk or a nun for 10 years, you're called a Thera. Maybe in, what is it in the female form? Is it Teri? I can't remember. And if you're a monk or nun for 20 years, you're a Mahathera nowadays. Or, you would be a Staivira in Sanskrit. That's just the Pali way of pronouncing it, Thera. So the Theravadins are one of these 18 schools of Vaibhashika. So much of this will be the same, although the 18 schools all had slightly different viewpoints. So this is just a general kind of a common ground of the 18 schools. Some of them would have slightly different views of it. We mentioned the text in general each of the sections is going to have how many outlines? Which? Seven. Okay. So what are those? Remember, it said at the beginning. You can look.
Oh, okay, got it.
Right. So each of the sections is going to be divided up into these 7 things. We're up to the 6th one already, I think, or the 5th one. So on the first page, it says the first school is explained by way of 7 points: definition, divisions, etymology, mode of asserting objects, mode of asserting subjects, which is translated here as object possessors. You could just write subjects. Mode of asserting selflessness, and the presentation of grounds and paths. So I think each of the philosophical schools will be broken up that way. And so we mentioned the definition of a Vaibhashaka. Anyone remember? You weren't here last time, were you? Yeah. And you weren't here. You're just visiting today, huh? Okay. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Kiva.
Kiva. Frank, do you remember the definition of a Vaibhashaka? Keep Frank on his toes tonight because he's got to be in the hospital for today.
Don't want to be on vacation. Which of the 7 points?
No, the first one, definition. So the definition of a Vaibhashaka is, see how many parts of it you can get. How could you delineate? How would you?
I don't remember. No.
Is it Mahayana or Hinayana propounder of tenets?
Hinayana?
It's a propounder of Hinayana tenets who
Asserts external objects to be truly existent while not asserting self-cognizers.
There you go. Okay. Asserting external objects to be truly existent. Okay. So that, in a sense, that's supposed to be sufficient to define a Vaibhashaka. I mean, there are many other ways you could define a Vaibhashaka in terms of all their tenets, but those points would eliminate someone from being a Sautrantika. Why wouldn't Sautrantika fit that definition? Kira, you gave the definition so eloquently and elegantly. Why wouldn't a Sautrantika fit that? Do you think?
I don't know.
Because the Sautrantikas assert self-cognizers. They are persons who propound Hinayana tenets, and they do assert external objects to be truly existent, but they don't assert self-cognizers.
They do.
They do not. They do assert self-cognizers. Here it says the Vaibhashikas do not. Sorry. Right. Okay. So then we had the divisions. We talked about the 3 or the 18 divisions. The etymology. Someone. They're called Vaibhashikas because they are followers of the Mahavibhasha, a great text, or because they propound the 3 times as particulars of substance. So you have to sort of, as we said before, you have to sort of see what the meaning of the name is. In Tibetan, Chittamatra. So here it says Dusum Zegi Cheta Dumawa. So the propounders propounding as substance, as particulars of substance, propounding the 3 times as particulars of substance. So it has that the words of Vaibhashaka in that kind of name. And then we talked about the mode of asserting objects a bit last time. So we said that there are, the definition of a thing is that which is able to perform a function. In fact, that definition, I believe, is something which all the Buddhist schools accept the upper tenets say that there are no permanent things. Nothing that's permanent is able to perform a function. The Vaibhashikas have the feeling that something like space, non-compounded space, could actually perform a function, something which is permanent. Okay, so we said there are 2 divisions: permanent things, impermanent things, and permanent things. Examples that are given in the Abhidharma Kosha are 3: space and the 2 cessations, they say. And of space, what it means is non-compounded space, so permanent space. Because there is another kind of space which is impermanent, what we call, you surprised? No? Okay. what we call intermediate space, or intermediately appearing space. Barnangi Namka, I think in Tibetan. So that's like when you look in the sky and you say, oh, look at space. There's outer space, something that's an object of eye consciousness. If it's an object of eye consciousness, it has to be impermanent, right? Something's an object of eye consciousness. Right, Venerable? Can you see anything that's permanent?
Is it space permanent that you see?
No, the space that uncompounded space, or non-compounded, however you want to call it, non-compounded space is permanent. But you don't see non-compounded space. You can't see non-compounded space because it's permanent. The objects of eye consciousness have to be impermanent. They have to be either shapes or colors. So what we see, what we talk about as space, is not really the space that's the permanent space. We're talking about a space which is impermanent, which is like when the sun is up, space looks maybe blue, sky looks blue. And, you can kind of sense the space with your eye consciousness. You don't see any obstruction. But the actual space is something that is known with your mental consciousness, the lack of obstructing contact. Okay, and we talked about the two cessations.
George, it gives us examples of permanent and impermanent things, but it doesn't tell us how to distinguish some new thing as being permanent or impermanent.
Mm-hmm. So, if we check the definitions, I think the definition of impermanent is that which is momentary. In Tibetan we say kechikma. That which, in other words, that which changes moment by moment. Every instant, what arises is different than what was there the previous moment. So we might think modern science, like if you look at the table, if you look at the cup, you might think of it as permanent, or especially a boulder. But if you're familiar with science, you would very simply say, oh yeah, I know that everything is moving. Every instant it's slightly different. Or like the stream. Who is it? The famous Greek philosopher who said you never step into the same stream twice. Who was that? Who's the philosopher here? Venerable, do you know? I can't remember. No. Do you know? Okay, someone out there who's watching this DV is saying, how come they don't know? And I've forgotten. A famous Greek philosopher, I think. Atisha is said to have liked to stop by streams and watch the stream and meditate on impermanence, because a stream looks the same, or a waterfall looks the same, right? But every instant the atoms, the molecules within it are different. There's a river near Borobudur in Indonesia, on Java, that supposedly it's recorded historically that Atisha sat and meditated. Someone brought me when I was visiting Borobudur. Is a good place to meditate on impermanence. So if you want to meditate on impermanence, that's a good place to do. You can go to a waterfall or to to a river. Or if you're really like one of these city dwellers who doesn't have those, you just turn on the faucet and just watch the faucet going. So impermanent things are momentary. Permanent things are non-momentary. That means moment by moment they remain the same. Say, for instance, when we talk about cessation, once anger is ceased from the mind by the application of its antidote, it is not as though one moment there's a little bit of anger and it's sort of vast, sort of oscillating in and out or something like that. It's gone forever. It doesn't come back. It's not so much the forever part, but the fact that it is not there. It is not coming and going when it's been ceased. When we have not ceased anger, even though we might apply temporal antidotes, it might anger might start to rise and we have to apply antidotes, and then we might go down. Sometimes when we're not as successful and our mind is more frustrated, it'll get up bigger. At other times we might be very successful, but that anger at that point has not been ceased. So that state is one that's momentary. It's changing.
So by cessation, are referring to the seeds have been removed as well, so they can't reappear, or that it's just not manifest?
That's right.
There's the other kind.
Actual cessation, we talk about true cessation, is one in which the seeds of the delusions have also been abandoned. Not necessarily their imprints, because the imprints are something even more subtle, but the seeds are what cause the delusions to rise. Like when we talk about, in the Mahayana sense, when the delusions and their seeds are abandoned, there might still be the imprints of those delusions that are called knowledge obstacles. But here we'll see in the Hinayana, especially in the Vaibhashika, they don't talk about obstructions to omniscience. They don't talk about knowledge obstacles. Okay, and then we had another. When we're talking about objects, there are other ways of dividing objects. We said there are conventional truths and ultimate truths, and so this is kind of quaint. Conventional truths are things that will, the apprehension of which disintegrate if you either break them or you analyze them into parts. Whereas ultimate truths are things that cannot be either broken or the apprehension of which disappears when you analyze them in parts, such as partless atoms, partless moments of consciousness, and what else? What's another one? And the non-compounded. Well, objects maybe not is a good word there, because objects in general, according to the lower tenets, are impermanent things. So you say the non-compounded phenomena, or in these tenets you say non-compounded things, because things can be non-compounded. And then also another way of talking about objects, I'm not sure if we saw it there, was in terms of the what do you call it? Contaminated and non-contaminated, or uncontaminated phenomena, contaminated. Did that come in the text, or that it comes in another place? So, do you remember what? In fact, there's a the flavor of the Abhidharma Kosha very much is that's one of the major ways they divide phenomena up into the contaminated and uncontaminated. I think the way that people used to translate that, in Tibetan we say sakche, sakbadang cheba, like Z-A-G, sakche, and sakme means without contamination. People used to translate that from the Sanskrit and the Pali as with fall and without fall, which doesn't sound too illustrative to me. Maybe it has some kind of taste when you understand what the implication is. Things that are susceptible of bringing you down. With fall and without fall maybe sounds like, San Diego is without fall and Oregon is with fall, or something like that. I'm joking. It's talking about autumn in America. No, Francois probably doesn't know. Do you know? Fall means autumn in American. So I'm joking. Anyway. So contaminated phenomena are most of the things that we experience in samsara. Uncontaminated phenomena are the path, the true path, and true cessations. So that doesn't talk much about it here, although it's a big subject in the Abhidharma Kosha. Then we talked a little bit about the mode of asserting subjects. Here calls object possessors, because that's how they take it in Tibetan. Yul Chen. Yul means object, and Yul Chen means having object, or possessing object possessor. So it's kind of, can be translated that way. And of the kinds of subjects that are talked about in the literature, we talk about persons and articulate sound and consciousness as three kinds of subjects. Entities which have or possess objects, especially consciousness possess objects because they perceive them, they cognize them. And so it begins talking about persons here, because persons are also subjects. And remember I mentioned that according to the some of the Vaibhashikas, the person, an illustration of the person, if you were asked to finally, even though they say the person is not, is empty of being permanent, partless, and independent, and empty of being self-supporting, substantially existent, still they say there is something you can point at as the person that you can find ultimately within the aggregates. And they say ultimately you can find an illustration of the person as either the mental consciousness. Some of them assert that. Some of them say the mere collection of the aggregates. Just the mere collection of the aggregates is the person. Actually, it's kind of subtle, even that, although the upper tenets don't accept that as an illustration of the person. Well, let's say the Prasangika does not accept that as an illustration of the person. Everyone below Prasangika says that you can find an illustration of the person somewhere within the aggregates. They'll say it might be the subtle continuum of the mental consciousness, or something is the person there. There's got to be something from the side there, or else how could you be calling it person? Prasangika says, no, there's nothing from the side. If you ask what the person is the merely imputed being, the being imputed, merely imputed on the aggregates. You can't find anything that illustrates that from the side of the parts. And so we said, when we talk about consciousness then, in terms of subjects, we say that there are valid consciousnesses and non-valid consciousnesses. Here's a famous word, pramana. Some of you who took a course last term remember this. You remember pramana? Pramana? He's thinking very hard. You remember? It sounds familiar.
I remember the word, but I just can't remember what it meant.
Okay. It's not that ice cream. That's pralines. Pralines. Pramana. Don't get it mixed up with that.
Promenade.
Promenade. That's not promenade. Lemonade. Pramana, or valid cognition. Well, some way maybe you can just say that which is valid, because we say there are valid persons and valid speech, although those are supposedly only etymological divisions of pramana. So valid cognition is something which can be relied on, that has gotten to the object, really knows the object, and according to these lower tenets, it is something which is fresh, it is new. So they take pra in pramana as meaning new. So remember from our lower grade class we had the definition of pramana was what?
Fresh, incontrovertible knower.
A new or fresh, incontrovertible knower. Incontrovertible means realizes its object. It cannot be controverted. There you go. Non-deceived. It is undeceived with respect to its object. Okay? So there are, and so what do you think? Most of the day, what are your sense consciousnesses? Are they, what do you think, Don? Are they? Yeah. Yeah. Yours, are they valid or are they invalid? Well, let's say, do they realize their objects? Because to be valid means they have to be fresh, so it's only the first instant of any train of thing. Are they realizing consciousnesses? Do they realize their objects? Or is most of our visual, audio, what's this one called? Olfactory, gustatory, tactile consciousnesses, are most of them erroneous and they don't realize their objects?
I think it depends on the different schools, but I think in this case, I think most of them are not new, but they do realize the conventional object.
Yeah, generally, it's rare that our sense consciousnesses don't realize their object. Sometimes we have distorted states of consciousness. But our mental consciousness has probably more often the case, well, let's say more often the case, a lot of the time we have non-realizing consciousnesses. Like when we talked about the 7 ways of knowing in Lorig, some of those were, wrong consciousness doesn't realize its object. Remember? And doubting consciousness, what do you think, Venerable? Does doubt realize its object?
I wouldn't think so.
What about doubt thinking? The Dalai Lama is probably a Buddha, but I'm not sure, but probably. Is that a realizing consciousness? Does that realize its object?
Not directly, is it?
No, it's not. It's not. It doesn't really realize because it's too pointed. For one thing, it hasn't reached any certainty. Even a correct belief, that thinks Dalai Lama is Buddha or something like that. Even that is not a realizing consciousness. It's not until you have an inference with your mental consciousness that you can realize something intellectually, with conception. You can realize it conceptually. Because our mental consciousness has 2 modes, conceptual and direct perception, perceptual. But most of the time now, we don't have any kind of mental direct perceptions. We have instances of it, but they go unnoticed by us. All of our mental activity now, you can say for the most part, is conceptual. And probably most of it hasn't realized its object by an inference, but maybe some cases. So there were 3 kinds of, or there are 2 kinds of valid cognizers: direct perceivers and valid inferential cognizers. And then there are 3 types of valid direct perceivers, unlike the Sautrantikas who say there are 4. Remember, because there are sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, and yogic direct perceivers. Yogic direct perceivers are a special kind of mental consciousness. You might say they're still, in a sense, they're still mental direct perceivers in a certain sense, but they only arise with respect to a certain state of mind, a union of shamatha and vipassana as a basis, and they only have certain objects. Here for the Vaibhashikas, the only objects of yogic direct perception are what? Do you remember? Did we get that far? Gross and subtle selflessness of persons, and subtle impermanence. Those are the only objects that they qualify as being objects of yogic direct perception that I see here.
We stopped just before that.
We stopped just before that. So there are 2 types of yogic direct perceivers. Yogic direct perceivers that clearly realize selflessness of persons, and yogic direct perceivers that clearly realize subtle impermanence. And then you could divide the former, the yogic direct perceivers that clearly realize selflessness of persons, into the gross and the subtle. Yogic direct perceivers that realize the emptiness of a permanent, partless, independent person, and yogic direct perceivers that realize the emptiness of self-supporting, substantially existent person. Here, Venerable Sangha kind of would put or. The sense of or, I'm not sure if it doesn't mean like it's one or the other. It's kind of explaining what, or in other words, self-supporting, or in other words, self-existent, substantially existent person. Here, self-supporting in the sense of being substantially existent. The word or doesn't appear in the Tibetan Rankya Tukbe, Tukya, Zeyu. So you could say self-supporting, substantially existent person. So this is very, very important, this concept, these 2 different levels. Have you heard, Venerable Enji, you've heard this before? These 2...
The self-supporting.
These 2 kinds of selflessness of persons? Or the opposite is the self of person. So the Buddhists, all the Buddhists in general say that the Vedic schools, this is why some of the Vedic schools, Vimal may know this, they say that the Buddha was which emanation of what was it? Not Brahma, Vishnu, do you know? Eighth incarnation or something. But they say he was kind of like, he appeared in order to show the wrong path. This is the Vedic presentation, so that the right path can be better understood. So the Buddhists would say, well, that's not exactly right. Because usually in the Vedic schools, which we call Hinduism today, that's not an old term. Hinduism is something that is a modern term, right? You know, it's sort of like, because of the area of India and the Indus River, Hinduism. So the various kind of Vedic schools all proposed there was an Atma. You know what Atma means? Self, or you could translate it as soul, or you could just say Atma. Why bother translating it? But I mean, that's kind of like, if you look at the attributes of it, it looks like what in religion and philosophy is called the soul, or we call the self. So sometimes you could translate Atma as self or soul. So Anatma, the Buddha taught, he didn't say there was Atma or an Atma. He said there was an Anatma, not an Atma. Together, an is the negative particle when the word begins with a. Usually, just a is enough. Just the letter a is a negating particle in Sanskrit. But if the word itself, like Atma, begins with a, you can't say Atma. You say Anatma. There's some other negative particles too, ni and some other things. But so Anatma means no self or selfless. We say dakme in Tibetan. Someone's name, right? Do you know someone named Dakme?
We used to.
Used to? That used to be your name?
No, Brandon.
Oh, Brandon. Dakme. Good name. Selfless. Anatma. So the Buddha taught Anatma. And so, but what he was saying was something very, very profound. In fact, it's the core of the Buddha's message. What all of the other method side of his teachings were all getting to, talking about selflessness, or that which is selfless. So what one tries to recognize this. So what he was saying was that there is some of the Vedic schools propound that there is a permanent, a partless and independent Atma that exists, and the road to liberation, moksha, involves realizing this. And if one can merge with that great Atma, that one can find nirvana. The same words. The Buddha. How do you say? What do you say when you?
Appropriate?
There you go. Appropriated. Used the same words that were already in common convention at the time: karma and klesha and atma and so forth, and moksha. Isn't that mocha? Don't get excited. Moksha. And nirvana and so forth. So the fundamental kind of assertion, all the Buddhist schools would assert that there is no permanent, partless, independent self or soul or atma. And here, even in the Vaibhashika system, that's considered to be the gross selflessness of persons. Okay? To realize that the person who is designated to the body and mind is empty of, you can use the word empty here, although they don't call it emptiness in general, is empty of a permanent, partless, independent person. Permanent can't be, because everything about us, even our subtle mental continuum, our body, everything about us is momentary. We're changing. There is nothing permanent about us. So in Christianity, do they talk about a permanent soul? Yeah. So we'd have to check. From a Buddhist perspective, there is an eternal mental continuum, but we distinguish between something which is permanent and eternal. Remember we talked a little bit last semester about the difference. Something could be eternal and impermanent. Like what? No?
The sky?
The sky? No. The sky is not eternal. Which sky do you mean? You mean space? No, that's permanent. That's space. What were you going to say, Lisa? No. Certainly, emptiness is not eternal, and because it always refers to something, the emptiness of the rose and so forth, or emptiness of the book, and it is permanent. So, what is something which is eternal and impermanent? Consciousness itself is an impermanent phenomena. It's one of the bases upon we label the person. Yet it is eternal. It doesn't have an end from the Buddhist perspective. Well, from the higher tenets. From the Vaibhashaka point of view and from the Sautrantika, once we attain nirvana, consciousness ceases. But we could talk about from a Mahayana point of view, there are some things which are eternal but impermanent. So eternal doesn't mean the same as permanent in general, although the words might be mistaken for one another. So here we're talking about the lack of, the Buddha said, there is no permanent, partless, independent person as was put forth in the Vedic teachings. A permanent soul, partless, that is, it cannot be divided into, various aggregates and so forth. Something which is without parts. Because the self itself, the Buddha, one of the basic teachings the Buddha taught was the person was designated or imputed to the collection of 5 aggregates. Remember, the 5 skandhas. So we have parts. It's not as though, in fact, none of them are the person, but the person is dependent upon those 5. So the person is not partless. And the person is not independent in the sense that can be understood from the sort of Vedic teachings of something which is independent. Like, also, there's a lot of philosophical debate, I think, in the sense of the Godhead in Christianity or other religions, whether that is totally independent. The sense, I think, of these religions when they talk about the Godhead being independent is that it can't be influenced by other things. It's the influencer. But from a Buddhist perspective, anything which influences other things is going to be something which is a creator has to be impermanent. It has to change moment by moment. It has to create at various times. So it's different moment by moment. And it does depend on causes and conditions. So that sense of the person, a permanent, partless, independent person, is a direct refutation of the sort of the Vedic systems. That's called the gross selflessness of persons, because that doesn't occur to people's minds intuitively, innately. That's something that comes about from inculcation of philosophical tenet, that there is a permanent, partless, independent soul. Okay, so that's called the gross selflessness of persons. The subtle selflessness of persons is something that does occur innately. Our sense of being substantially existent in this sense. Substantially existent has many different kinds of instances that are found in the scriptures. There's different meanings of substantially existent. Here is talking about a self-supporting substantial existence. So what does that mean? There are phenomena which are, from the lower tenets point of view, there are 2 kinds of phenomena. Another way of dividing them up, I have my rosary to do this, imputedly existent phenomena and substantially existent phenomena. Imputedly existent phenomena is something like the rosary, or an army, or a forest. An imputedly existent phenomena is one in which you cannot perceive the phenomena at first unless you perceive the whole collection of parts. Just seeing 1 or 2 soldiers in your front yard, you haven't perceived the army. You have to see the Army is imputed to a collection of soldiers. And rosary is if you just had one bead sitting on the table with no string, it would be you could kind of say, oh, there's my rosary, but that's not considered correct. There are other kinds of phenomena that are called, this is from the lower point of view of the Vaibhashika, things that are called substantially existent phenomena, that there is a substance there, like the flower is substantially existent. Although you can argue, well, it has parts too. It said that the shape of the flower, in the case of flower, I think it's the shape that's considered to be ultimately the flower. And other phenomena have certain quality about them. So one of their attributes will be what they actually are, which you actually define them as being, and that are substantially existent, that you can kind of find them. So the Buddha said that the person is not substantially existent the way that it appears to our mind on a subtle level. You might think on a subtle level it seems like an independent person, impermanent, partless, and independent. Remember the gross self of persons? That independent, though, is even grosser than what you're thinking of. Here, when we talk about a substantially existent person, there seems to be one which is like a substance from its own side, like the controller. I like to give this example, like the taster. Like why do you put the chocolate on the tongue? Why do you nuzzle noses, I was just teasing. Dorje was seen to be nuzzling noses last week. Why do you... Why does one... what motivates this is a sense of self as though a substance that could be found and localized. Here, that is kind of self-supporting. It's the example that's sometimes given in the scriptures is this. The sense of a self-supporting, substantially existent person, if you look at it very carefully, is a sense of self which is not totally different from the aggregates and not identical with the aggregates. It's not like I am the body, I am the mind, I'm the feelings. Those are gross occurrences in our own consciousness now. Sometimes we think if someone praises you, how smart you are, you think, oh, it almost like you identify with the mind. If someone says, oh, you're looking great, or oh, you're looking old, we might identify with the body. But beyond those, there are subtler senses of the self. Here in the Vaibhashika tenets, in the Hinayana, we're talking about a slightly subtler one in which the self seems to be as though, the example that's sometimes given, the head merchant of a group of merchants, or in modern parlance we would say the head salesperson of a group of salesperson. The head salesperson is still a salesperson, right? Or say salesman, saleswoman. This head salesman is a salesman, but is somehow different. So it's almost as though the self seems to be the self-supporting, substantially existent I that we do perceive of, seems to be of a different nature. It seems to be not of a different nature than the aggregates, but not identical with them either. Kind of like that which commands the aggregates. Okay? So that, the understanding that sense of self does not exist, is that we are empty of that kind of self, is called the subtle selflessness of persons for the Vaibhashikas. In fact, the Sautrantikas also accept that same kind of delineation, the gross selflessness of persons, the subtle selflessness of persons. Chittamatra also accepts a similar kind of thing.